It's 6:30 on the dot, and let me start by. Ooh, you can't hear me. Well, you can hear me. Yeah. Let me say again, welcome to each and every one of you to our teaching, The Future of Dialogue in the Church and Theological Education in a Post-Truth Era. As president of Lexington Theological Seminary, I have the pleasure of being able to sit in and listen to our students and faculty, staff, and the entire community as we try to think about what does the future of theological education look like, and how will we engage one another? I think our topic tonight is particularly important as we think about how in the next week, month, year, days, are we going to be able to have conversations with each other? I said earlier to some folks that in the first grade, we learn to raise our hand. We learn to say please and thank you. We learn how to ask good questions, and we begin the process of discerning truth. Well, in today's common square, public square, truth has a question mark behind it. If it's 5 o'clock, I say, is it 5 o'clock? It really is. But there's debate about that issue. And so today, what we want to do is begin a process of reclaiming dialogue and conversation as a way of reclaiming truth for our churches, for our communities, for our society. Conversation matters, dialogue matters. And so tonight, as we listen to our panelists, I hope that you will be able to begin that process for yourself, for your congregation, and for those that you engage with. Conversation matters. Dr. Loida Martell is our Vice President and Academic Dean, as well as Professor of Constructive Theology and leader of our faculty. And so she'll be moderating this panel, and as you can see, quite ably. And so I invite Dr. Martell to come forth in a moment, right after our Professor Jerry Sumney offers prayer. And so welcome and help us engage in conversation. Jerry, Dr. Sumney.
Thank you, Dr. Gillette. Would you all pray with me? God of all glory and truth, we thank you for all the gifts that you give us. We thank you for the beauty of the seasons, of the years. They are changing now, even as we ask you to be with those who are suffering in the cold and darkness. We thank you for the gifts that enable us to come together from so many places and have important conversations. God of wisdom and truth, we thank you for the amazing way that you have constructed our world and our lives. But we ask that you would help us to make better use of the wisdom and the knowledge that you give us. Help us to seek to discern what our desires and prejudice and selfishnesses are, and to distinguish them from the actual state of things and the truth that you would have us see, accept, and respect. And God of all patience, we thank you for the many times and the many ways that you have had patience with us. We thank you for loving us despite our turning from how you would have us live with and for one another. And we thank you for the patience you have in forgiving us so many times. And we ask that you would help us to reflect the patience that you have shown us in the ways that we relate to those that we disagree with. Help us to show them grace, even as we speak the truth that you show us. And we ask that you would bless our time together. Help us learn from each other things that can help us live your will more fully and advance the borders of your kingdom. And it's in the name of Christ that we pray. Amen.
Thank you. That was Professor Jerry Sumney, who is Professor of Biblical Studies at LTS. We're very grateful for him. I believe he has another commitment and might be leaving us later on, but we're very grateful for the time that he's taken to be with us. It is my honor and my privilege to introduce to you each of the panelists, and I will be introducing them in the order in which they will be presenting. I'm going to present to you all of the panelists at once so that I can give them the maximum time allowable for their presentations. I'm going to ask Ms. Dominique Heifel, who is our able technician, if she is able to highlight the speakers as I am presenting them. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Christy Newton. Dr. Christy Newton is an ordained minister in Christian Church Disciples of Christ who received her MDiv from Pacific School of Religion and a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in the interdisciplinary disciplines of theology, globalization, and material culture. She has worked in campus ministry and church relations at Chapman University and served Disciples and United Church of Christ congregations in Arkansas and California for over 20 years. Currently, she serves as the senior minister of the First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Vallejo, California, and she teaches courses in social ethics, practical theology, and spirituality for Lexington Theological Seminary and Pacific School of Religion. She is energized by practical and public theologies that insist on hospitality and compassion, and she is inspired to help individuals and communities to find ways to sustain their prophetic voice in difficult and polarized world. Dr. Newton will present on the ethics of dialogue in the age of QAnon. Reverend Dr. Richard Lowry is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He earned a master's in divinity and a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Yale University. His bachelor's degree is from the University of Tennessee, which recently honored him with the prestigious Charles H. Reynolds Distinguished Alumnus Award. He served as a Johnny Ergo Cadieu, and I'm sorry if I messed that up a little bit. That was a French name spoken with a Puerto Rican accent there. Of Hebrew Bible at Phillips Theological Seminary. He served also as the interim vice president and dean of Lexington Theological Seminary and as contingent faculty in various institutions, including here at LTS. He is a member and former president of the Association of Disciples for Theological Discussion. He has written and collaborated on a number of books, including Sabbath Jubilee and Chalice Introduction to the Old Testament, both published by Chalice Press, among other publications. He's a well-known speaker and preacher, and Dr. Lowry joins us today to present on the topic, Truth, Lies, and Dialogue in the Community of Faith, a Biblical Perspective. Dr. Michael Remedios Grigoni. Dr. Grigoni is visiting assistant professor of theology and Roman Catholic studies here at Lexington Theological Seminary. Originally from the Pacific Northwest, he earned his BA in philosophy from Western Washington University, his MA in ethnomusicology from the University of Washington, his MTS in theology from Harvard Divinity School, and his PhD in religion from Duke University. His research and teaching interests center on Christian ethics, political theology, and ethnographic theology. His dissertation, titled The Gun in U.S. American Life, in ethnographic Christian ethics, develops a Christian ethics of handgun ownership that emerges from ethnographic fieldwork he carried out with Christian handgun owners and Christian anti-gun violence activists in the Triangle region of North Carolina. Dr. Grigoni will speak to us about dialogue, politics, and guns, a case study. Our final speaker will be Reverend Dr. Leah Shade. The Reverend Dr. Leah Shade is the Assistant Professor of Preaching and Worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. And an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church, Church in America for 20 years. There she is. Dr. Shade earned both her MDiv and PhD degrees from Lutheran Theological Seminary of Philadelphia, now known as United Lutheran Seminary. She has authored or co-edited 5 books, including Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry in the Red-Blue Divide, published by Rowman and Littlefield, which explores how clergy and congregations can address controversial social issues using nonpartisan, biblically centered approaches and deliberative dialogue. She is the project director of the grant from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion, exploring the use of dialogue in congregations and theological education, which has led us to this teach-in today. Dr. Shade will present on the topic, Preaching and Dialogue, Creating a Culture of Truth, Accountability, and Empathy. As always, I want to remind all of you that we do have a Q&A section. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section and your comments and observations in the chat. Thank you so very much for joining us, and we will begin with Dr. Newton.
It is certainly a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are. And I want to especially thank Dr. Shade and LTS for the opportunity to speak on this important topic and to engage in this very important conversation. My topic is the ethics of dialogue in the age of QAnon. The Chinese deliberately exported COVID-19. The election was stolen from Trump. Hillary killed some of her political adversaries. The Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax. Obama was born in Kenya. The California wildfires are started by Jewish space lasers. Democrats are Satan-worshiping pedophiles. How do we engage in productive dialogue when any one of these statements is the starting point? Should we even try? And how do we participate in ministry with people who honestly believe things that contradict the very fabric of our reality? The goal of ethical dialogue at any time and in any circumstances, especially in the age of QAnon, has to be opening up honest conversation and inviting deep, inclusive engagement with important issues with the goal of increasing, widening, and promoting the common good. And to do this, we must develop and establish ethical frameworks capable of guiding public conversations about ways to live together in pluralistic, globalizing civil societies, and ways our ultimate concern for the common good might guide our churches, our government and institutions, business enterprises, and voluntary associations. The first and foundational step in establishing these ethical frameworks is to acknowledge that we all engage in hermeneutics, acts of interpretation. We interpret information, ideas, texts, people, events. Each and every one of us has a hermeneutic. A fundamentalist, however, is someone who thinks they don't have a hermeneutic. Someone who thinks interpretation does not play a role in how they understand reality, as if reality and answers simply drop from the sky into their thoughts. But denying our engagement in hermeneutics betrays a shocking lack of self-awareness, which is an essential component of ethical dialogue. Our minds and emotions are always working beneath and behind our interpretation of things, privileging certain ideas, sources, and information. Our awareness of the ways we privilege information positions us to engage in deeper and more meaningful ethical dialogue. Our self-awareness about our hermeneutics establishes our ethical connection with one another and prescribes how we interact with one another, how we relate to our neighbor, who we see as our neighbor, how we move and relate with others in the world. With greater self-awareness, we have a deeper understanding of the information, ideas, people we privilege, what interpretations hold sway, what questions we live by. Do we place law over love and compassion? Or do we place love and compassion over law? How do we understand and interpret the common good? What is the role of faith in the public sphere? And in the increasingly diverse societies that we live in, where disagreement about ethics and values continually confront us, is it even possible to have a shared understanding of the common good? How might we best build a just society? How should we treat one another, especially the most vulnerable among us? The church has a pivotal role in these conversations, if for no other reason than we are explicitly called to care for the least of these. The church is called to a life of social engagement and possesses profound resources. It is ideally situated to shed fresh light on issues of public concern and to contribute insight to public debate and policy formation. Calling upon the church, however, isn't about promoting Christian interests in the public sphere over other faiths. It is about applying the resources, insights, and compassionate values of faith in ways that contribute to the welfare and well-being of all in society, at a time when many of the religious, so-called Christian voices we hear in the public sphere decidedly do not strive for the common good, but work strictly for their own good, their own pockets, their own congregations or communities, or their own narrow interpretations of faith. Everywhere we look in business, government, economics, education, city planning, environmental protections, church, and on, we are given permission to focus exclusive concern on our own narrow interests, no matter the greater social costs. Selfishness is often deemed a virtue, yet making ourselves our ultimate concern has spiritual consequences. It limits our vision, it stunts our courage, and it amounts to idolatry, which means we must actively make an ethical choice. We can choose God or mammon. And if we choose God, we must broaden the focus of ethical dialogue beyond ourselves and actively oppose and resist the structures and policies that engineer all of society toward the accumulation of wealth for a privileged few at the expense of the common good. Our lives are deeply embedded in social relationships. No matter how isolated any of us has felt during this time of pandemic and sheltering in place, none of us is truly an isolated individual. We are interdependent, each dependent upon one another, but also greater than the sum of our individual parts. Both church and politics begin and end with community. This is why they exist. And whether we like it or not, and whether we intend it or not, our private beliefs always produce public outcomes. And for this reason, another aspect of our ethical framework must be listening to those people who have the most at stake in the conversation. We must interrogate our own assumptions and biases, our hermeneutics about social justice and the common good. We must pay attention to our relationship to privilege, our access to resources, and allow ourselves to be accountable to the greatest stakeholders, to those whose lives are most affected, so that the unjust systems and structures that threaten their survival and keep them from thriving can be changed. Only with informed knowledge and earnest listening, grasping the full implications of what is at stake, can we engage in deep and honest conversation. And we must also be aware, though, that there are those who feel threatened by the common good, willing to do all they can within their power to undermine this work. These entrenched power holders certainly do not welcome a call toward greater moral accountability. And they will do everything they can to disparage and dismiss legitimate concerns if they impede on their own self-interest. They frequently resort to the age-old tactic of divide and conquer to get their way, pitting oppressed groups against one another, attempting to make enemies of natural allies. But if we allow it, conflict can provide opportunity. Conflict allows us to see and learn from diverse perspectives, even voices we might not want to hear at first. Conflict reminds us that we are indeed greater than the sum of our parts. And conflict also fuels a transformative energy that can help us gain insights and see solutions we might otherwise miss on our own. Utilizing conflict has the potential to counteract the efforts of divide and conquer by pointing us toward areas for growth and possibilities for appreciating others' reservoirs of experience and knowledge. When we do this, we understand perhaps even more deeply the importance of forming allies across and alliances across divisions and boundaries to further the work toward justice and the common good. When we think about the ethics of dialogue in the church and in theological education in these days, it is crucial that we insist upon increasing self-awareness and deepening critical thinking, intentionally prioritizing self-aware, thoughtful, and critical conversation over suspicion, conspiracy, and fear. We must set boundaries that protect the most vulnerable and refuse to validate speech that demonizes or tears another down for one's own benefit. It is also important to broaden the focus of ethical dialogue beyond ourselves. Who has the most at stake in this conversation? And what is their perspective? And as the book of Ephesians reminds us, we must speak the truth in love. This is what ethical dialogue looks like, sounds like, and acts like in a world where truth is in jeopardy. Thank you.
Okay, am I on now?
Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, all right. Hope everybody can hear me. I want to begin by expressing my appreciation to Leah Shade for the article A in the subtitle she suggested for my presentation, A Biblical Perspective. My comments will be a perspective among several. There's not, to my mind, even a single unitary biblical perspective on the topic we're discussing tonight. Written over a period of centuries by a variety of people with a great diversity of economic, political, and theological interests informing what they wrote, the Bible itself is a kind of mass conversation over many centuries between multiple perspectives and voices, a mosaic, if you're feeling generous, a jumbled cacophonous mess, if you're not. There's not a biblical perspective, there are many. Diversity of perspective, a pluralism of viewpoint is a basic, inescapable characteristic of biblical witness. So what follows is a perspective informed by biblical perspectives, plural. The fact that there are multiple biblical perspectives is the first and most important thing I want to say as we ponder together truth, lies, and dialogue in the community of faith. I want to begin by turning our attention to a dual saying in Proverbs 26, 4-5. Do not answer fools according to their folly, or you will be a fool yourself. Answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes. Now, there are a couple of things I want to say about this striking juxtaposition of directly contradictory advice as a lead-in to my discussion tonight. For the wise women and men of ancient Israel, context is important when you're thinking about truth, lies, and dialogue in the community of faith. Where should we begin when we're considering the truth or falsehood of a thing and trying to figure out what to do about it? Should we offer a response when someone says something ridiculous, or should we let it pass and just move on? Well, the wise would say, it depends. There's no hard and fast rule that applies in all circumstances. To a certain extent, we just have to play it by ear, wing it. Context is important, both in determining the truth and in figuring out how to act on it. Another important thing suggested by these two verses from Proverbs is that the propagation of lies and falsehood has a moral claim on those of us who hear it, and our response requires judgment. There are moral stakes in our response to untruth, both for ourselves and for those who are propagating the lie. We risk becoming fools ourselves by giving the foolishness the dignity of a response. But on the other hand, we also have a moral, perhaps even a compassionate responsibility to set the record straight by challenging the purveyor of the falsehood and thus helping them or others convinced by them to avoid continued foolishness that might end in humiliation or disaster. The ultimate goal, of course, is to protect the community against dangerous delusions. But the particular course of action to achieve that larger goal at any given moment depends on the circumstances. This on the one hand, on the other hand kind of approach is classic wisdom teaching in the ancient world. Life is not so much obeying a rigid set of rules as it is sizing things up as best you can and acting appropriately for your own integrity and for the greater good of the community. This approach is rooted in the practical experience of women and men tasked with overseeing and managing the daily and ongoing work of household farms, and in the practical experience of royal courtiers, the middle managers who kept the instruments of governance in the ancient world running. That's a defining characteristic of biblical wisdom. It's practical, rooted in experience and geared toward results. I would suggest that that experiential practicality needs to be a part of our reflection on truth, lies, and dialogue in the community of faith. The truth, the question of truth, has real world consequences. The stakes can be high, even deadly, as we saw on January 6th on the steps and in the halls of the US Capitol, which makes me think that the dangerous realities of the current moment puts us on the answer fools side of the dual-sided proverb I quoted. But how do we go about determining what's foolishness and what's not? What's true and what's false? Biblical literature, as I've said, offers a variety of answers, but I want to highlight and focus on just a couple that I think are important for our reflection tonight. History, practical experience, practical results, and the story, theology, and practice of the community are important things to think about as we seek to get to the truth of things. There's several texts that come to mind, but I'll mention here a couple. Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22 condemns any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, or who presumes to speak in my name, a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak. That prompts the logical question, well, how do we recognize a word that God has not spoken? Well, the Deuteronomist answers, if a prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh, but the thing does not take place or prove true, it's a word that Yahweh has not spoken. Pay it no mind. Well, thank you for that. This straightforward recommendation obviously requires a bit of unpacking. I mean, who exactly is the prophet who speaks in the name of other gods? Perhaps one way of answering the question is that a true prophetic word is one that resonates with the God Israel knows from the communal story of liberation from bondage, the stories of Exodus, redemption, and return from exile. For us as Christians, we would add the story of Jesus, his life, healing ministry, crucifixion on an imperial cross, and world-transforming resurrection. A prophet who speaks in the name of other gods is the one whose word does not resonate with that story, is not consistent with that liberating, world-transforming story of Israel and of Jesus Christ. The God of Israel embraces and rescues the ger. Ger is a Hebrew word probably best translated as immigrant worker, a sometimes marginal non-citizen who nevertheless works in our community and contributes to its overall welfare. It's a word that encompasses the refugee, the migrant worker, the person or family who for whatever reason find themselves displaced and residing for a while in our territory. God's love for all people is focused particularly and clarified particularly in God's gracious acts of mercy toward these, the world's most vulnerable. Any statement, theological or otherwise, that contradicts this fundamental faith conviction rooted in the experience of the community, that God sides with the immigrant, the hurting, the oppressed, the wretched of the earth. Any statement inconsistent with that basic theological conviction is, in the context of the community of faith, a lie. It is spoken in the name of other gods, the gods of greed, domination, oppression, false ideologies, which in America's case is ideologies of white supremacy, conquests of indigenous peoples, and reckless domination of the natural world. True statements about God and the world in this biblical view are consistent with the one whom Israel knows in the story of Exodus from bondage and exile. True theological statements point us toward the God who liberates, who opposes that which oppresses, who degrades, dehumanizes, and leads to despair. True theological statements orient our actions and convictions toward the God who frees and empowers us, and thus calls us to join in the broader historical project of freedom and empowerment. The second part of the two-part test of true and false prophecy in our passage from Deuteronomy 18 is at first blush ridiculous. If you want to know whether a given prophetic utterance is true or not, just wait around and see if it actually happens. If it does, it was true all along. If it doesn't, it obviously was a lie, not a genuine word from Yahweh. Well, there's a lot I'd like to say about this, but I'll just note that the advice here seems pretty worthless when you're a king trying to make a crucial decision at a moment of crisis and you're confronted with directly contradictory prophetic oracles. Say, for example, from Jeremiah and Hananiah, both of whom were acknowledged and credentialed prophets. How do you decide which one to believe? Deuteronomy says, well, wait and see which one's word proves true. Jeremiah offers a slight refinement of the Deuteronomic advice. In Jeremiah 28, 8, 9, after telling Hananiah, amen, I hope you're right that we're going to get out of this mess, Jeremiah says this: the prophets who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war, famine, and pestilence among many countries and great kingdoms. As for the prophet who prophesies peace, when the word of that prophet comes true, then we will know that Yahweh has truly sent the prophet. In other words, you can generally trust a prophetic word that makes the comfortable uncomfortable, that challenges those at the top of the heap. But prophetic words that further empower the powerful and soothe the conscience of those who oppress need to meet a much higher bar. I just want to wrap up here, I think I'm running out of time, by expanding the biblical scope just a little bit with a story almost certainly born from the experience of Babylonian exile. Genesis 1 tells a story of God's creation of the world by flagrantly subverting the Babylonian imperial myth of creation, the Enuma Elish. The hero of that story is Marduk, patron god of the imperial capital of Babylon. Marduk successfully defeats and kills the deity of primordial chaos, forming the dome of the sky and the disk of the earth from her corpse. Using the blood of her slain consort, Marduk makes human beings to be slaves to the gods. So we're created to be slaves in this story, planting and tending their crops and flocks and herds, hunting and slaughtering meat, which we then should burn as food offerings to the gods. For Marduk's great wisdom in creating human slaves so the gods could live lives of leisure, he is crowned king of the gods and given ultimate dominion in the universe. Now, of course, gods don't normally leave heaven and walk around on earth. So gods appoint managers of their estates on earth. Those managers just happen to be the kings who sit on the royal throne. In Babylon's case, the Babylonian king was the designated representative of Marduk on earth. So questioning or rejecting the earthly authority of the Babylonian king was not just treason, it was blasphemy. It threatened the cosmic order established by the gods. Now, when the kings extended the reach of their authority to the lands of other nations, territories controlled by other gods, those now under the authority of the emperor were understood to be under the cosmic authority of the patron god of the empire. This territorial expansion of the empire and its cosmic legitimation was given physical expression by the erection of monuments called stelae. Was the ancient equivalent of raising a flag. Think of that famous picture and monument of the raising of the American flag at Iwo Jima in World War II, or the words of the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag that o'er the ramparts we watched was so gallantly gleaming. It's a territorial and a political claim. Oh, I got a minute. At the top of this stela, which made the claim for the imperial king, there was a carved picture called a psalmu, a word that we normally translate at image. Metaphorically, the emperor or king was thought of as the psalmu of God in the earth, the sign, the image, the raised flag representing the authority of the imperial deity. The priestly writer of Genesis 1 knew that story and revamped it. In Genesis 1:26, God says, let's make humankind in our image. That's that word, psalmu. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God created them, male and female. We are created as the sign of God's authority in the world. And therefore, we stand with the dignity and the power and the authority of God. I just want to say one final thing, and that is that the Enuma Elish ends with the gods being able to take leisure. The biblical story in Genesis 1 ends with God resting so that all of creation can rest. We are created in the image of God. We have the fundamental dignity and power of that God-given image. Thank you.
We're now going to take a 5-minute break. I have 7:13, so we will return at 7:18 on the dot and continue. We want to give you all an opportunity to stand and stretch. So we are going to have a 5-minute break. We will be back at 7:18 and continue with Dr. Michael Grigoni. Thank you. It is 7:18. And we're going to continue with our presentations with Michael Grigoni.
Excellent. Good evening. I'd like to first say a word of thanks to my co-panelists, Dr. Christy Newton and Dr. Richard Lowry, and a word of thanks also to Dr. Leah Shade, Dean Lloyd Martell, and President Sharice Gillette for the invitation tonight and for the opportunity to talk about these pressing issues that we're exploring together this evening. So I'm going to come to these issues by way of research I've been conducting on the place of guns in US American life, and in particular, the overlap between American gun culture and conservative evangelical Protestantism in the United States. And in doing so, I'll be describing research I conducted while pursuing a doctorate in Christian theology and ethics at Duke University. So first, a bit about my project. I titled my dissertation, The Gun in US American Life, an Ethnographic Christian Ethics. And as the title indicates, my project asks a Christian ethical question, namely, how should Christians think about and orient themselves to guns? I didn't want to explore this question in a vacuum, however. So hence, as my title also indicates, I used a method called ethnography to both ground and advance my Christian ethical reflections. Ethnography is a method developed by cultural anthropologists to study culture or particular ways of being in the world. The method requires that ethnographers immerse themselves in the culture under investigation by spending time with the members of a community, talking with them, doing what they do, and so on over a lengthy period of time. I took up this method because I was convinced that if I was going to say something meaningful about guns from a Christian ethical perspective, I had to attend to the lived experience of gun owners. I had to get up close and personal, so to speak, with this way of being in the world. Before giving an account of what I learned, I just want to take a moment to briefly describe the myriad ways in which guns shape and affect our common life, and how we might imagine the shaping to constitute a wound. As many of you know, the US has by far the highest rate of private firearm ownership among high-income nations in the world. And additionally, the US has, again, by far, the highest rate of firearm-caused death among high-income nations in the world. This fact, in and of itself, is a wound in our common life. Further, the gridlock that marks public discourse on guns shows no signs of easing despite the tragic recurrence of mass shootings in contexts formerly considered immune to such violence. School classrooms like Sandy Hook Elementary of Newtown, Connecticut, and Stoneman Douglas High of Parkland, Florida, and also churches like Mother Emanuel of Charleston, South Carolina, and First Baptist of Sutherland Springs, Texas. This gridlock, this inability to talk productively about guns, despite these tragedies, is also a wound. And further, as we've recently witnessed, guns are being carried openly more and more at sites of political demonstration. And here I'm thinking about the presence of armed demonstrators protesting state lockdowns aimed at curbing the spread of COVID-19 at the state Capitol building in Michigan, for example. But I'm also thinking about the storming of the Capitol building on January 6th. While guns did not necessarily play a determinative role in the events of that day, it is uncontroversial to state that they play a role in the far-right, nativist, and Christian nationalist political imaginary that was on display that day. And this is also a wound in our common life. But for me, ultimately, as the son of an evangelical Protestant, the particular feature of this landscape that compels me most and that led me to my dissertation topic is the entanglement of guns and conservative Christianity in everyday life in the United States. Sociologists have established that higher rates of gun ownership appear among conservative or evangelical Protestants than other religious groups. This wound presses me to ask, why do the followers of a crucified Savior feel it necessary to incorporate firearms so deeply and intimately into their everyday lives in the United States? And how do they understand this incorporation to be consistent with their faith? I draw the image of the wound, which I've been using here, from Mary McClintock Fulkerson, who describes her own theological work as theology done in response to a wound. And I think the image is quite fitting. Guns and their myriad of effects, as I've just described, constitute a wound in our common life, one that calls out for theological reflection and redress. And to carry the image further, how does one treat a wound? Well, one needs to get close to it. One needs to examine the wound before being able to determine how to treat it. And that's precisely what ethnography, as a method of studying ways of being in the world, permits. And so in 2017, I began carrying out ethnographic research with Christian handgun owners, the majority of whom were white evangelical Protestant men in Durham, North Carolina, and Durham County. In keeping with ethnography's emphasis on immersion, I spent time with these men, talking with and interviewing them, shooting with them, shadowing them while they performed church security, and so on. So let me describe a bit of what I encountered. Some of these men were pastors who were nervous about the possibility of an active shooter scenario erupting during their Sunday morning service. While visiting a megachurch, for example, a security team leader repeatedly used the phrase protector to describe himself during our conversation, saying that he, quote, has a protector's heart because God designed him that way, end quote. During a church security workshop I attended, a pastor, after leading us in prayer, asked us to think about the image of the shepherd, saying, what does it mean to be a shepherd in a world in which violence is all around us? What does it mean for pastors to protect the sheep of their flock? End quote. This was how the church security workshop was framed. Further, many of the men I spoke with were fathers who told me that they see the protection of their families as integral to their role as fathers and parents. As husbands and parents. Some even claim that if they did not have children, they would not own handguns or concealed carry, that their sense of obligation derives entirely from the desire to protect the bodies of their children and their spouse. It's a bit of the texture I encountered, but more formally, I can summarize my findings as follows. Christian handgun owners, as I encountered them, have a deep sense of precarity that pervades their experience of public and private space, in the workplace, church, and home. They believe that all of space and time houses the possibility of encountering an active shooter. And so they engage in a series of practices to mitigate this sense of precarity, whether through concealed carry or regularly training with their firearms or serving on an armed church security team. Further, they see these practices as an extension of their Christian discipleship as men. For them, handgun ownership and concealed carry constitute what responsible Christian men do as fathers, husbands, and church members. And further, as a result of engaging in these practices, these men form their bodies and subjectivities in anticipation of a day to come, a day in which they may have to use their firearms to defend themselves or others. I argue that preparing for this day superimposes itself upon an evangelical Christian temporal imaginary, in which life is lived in anticipation of the day in which Jesus Christ will return. As such, US American gun culture and conservative Christianity symbiotically cohere with each other with respect to a shared temporality of anticipation. One of my interlocutors, quoting Matthew 24, which likens the coming of the Son of Man to the coming of a thief in the night, once said in the context of an interview, the thief comes when you think not, so don't ever think not. So he used that scripture in a way that kind of echoes the argument I'm making about this shared temporality of anticipation. And while there's so much more to say about this, my dissertation describes this as one orientation to guns by persons of Christian faith in US American life, one that involves adopting a posture of care with a tool of violence in the anticipation of violence, a posture and way of being in the world that emerges from an intensely felt ethical demand. But I did not simply carry out fieldwork with Christian handgun owners. I also carried out fieldwork with an organization called the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham, an interfaith group that holds public vigils at the sites of firearm-caused death throughout the city of Durham. I did not initially expect that my research would include this community, but after attending a vigil, I decided to extend my fieldwork to include the coalition's vigil ministry. It was at the vigil's side that I began to discern that a Christian ethics of the gun in US American life must attempt to think these two orientations together, that of the Christian handgun owner and that of the vigil keeper. To give you a sense of what it was like to attend a vigil, I'd like to now read a vignette from my dissertation that describes my first experience attending one. I was told by the individual who invited me that the vigil was being held for a young African-American man who had been killed earlier in the year by gunshot at the age of 35. The vigil was being held on what would have been his 36th birthday. I felt nervous about attending, unsure about what to wear and what to expect. The past year, I'd become used to inhabiting gun sites, and I'd figured out how to enter and exit these spaces in a way that felt somewhat natural. In preparing for the vigil, I realized I would have to discover a new kind of inhabitants. I entered a neighborhood I'd never been to before, driving between rows of small, rundown rectangular brick homes. As I arrived, a school of blue balloons floated above a mass of umbrellas. Nearly everyone gathered was African American, except for a handful of white presenting participants. Many of those gathered wore a t-shirt with the deceased's photo and name. We stood in damp dirt, a series of concentric circles beneath a grove of trees, trying to avoid the rain. There was prayer followed by hymns sung in call and response, in a time to share remembrances about the deceased. Lastly, an older African American woman spoke, identifying the space as a brush harbor. She said, quote, "Our ancestors used to pray in places like this in brush harbors," end quote. I was struck by this. Brush harbors were places where enslaved Africans assembled and worshiped away from the eyes of the master. They were secret, concealed places. Upon hearing her words, I realized that in all of my efforts to understand the place of the gun in US American life, this particular site had been out of view. In my movement from gun shops, gun ranges, churches with armed security, and the homes of Christian handgun owners, I had never entered this neighborhood. The Vigil remained a brush harbor, a hidden place, obscured from the eyes of the master. As such, it reflected and manifested how the gun and race in US American life not only conditioned ways of seeing, but ways of not seeing. This recognition emerged for me at the Vigil's side. The woman began to pray, asking God not simply for peace for the family and the neighborhood, but for a just peace. She asked God to change the conditions that prevent the flourishing of a just peace within her community, conditions that other communities have long enjoyed and in which gun violence is rare. The vigil ended with gatherers turning from the grove toward the road. And as they did so, they released the balloons into the air, shouting happy birthday and cheering as they did so. I stood on the periphery and watched. Having shared this vignette, I want to close by asking more precisely, what does the vigil disclose? Well, on the one hand, it discloses a different orientation to guns by persons of Christian faith. In contrast to Christian handgun owners who take up firearms in the anticipation of violence, the coalition and its vigil ministry aims to craft a faithful response to the presence of guns in US American life and the effects of guns in the aftermath of violence. Both arguably are postures of care, but the posture of the Christian handgun owner is inward directed, focused on one's family and church, whereas the latter, that of the vigil keeper, is outward facing, extending to those who bear the brunt of gun violence in one's community. But I want to argue that for persons of Christian faith, the vigil discloses something else, which I discerned in engagement with the work of James Cone and Kelly Brown Douglas. In The Cross and the Lynching Tree, James Cone develops a critique of antiseptic accounts of the cross in white US American Christianity to argue that we must see the cross and the lynching tree together, and that in Christ crucified, we must see God's identification with the Black lynched body. And that when we do so, the cross becomes a critique of both the lynching tree and the broader racialized structures of violence that underwrote the terror of lynching in US American history. Kelly Brown Douglas, in her book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, makes a similar argument with regard to stand your ground laws, seeing Trayvon Martin, a young man who in 2012 was pursued, shot, and killed in Florida by a member of the community's Neighborhood Watch, also as Christ crucified. And via this association, Douglas critiques stand your ground laws and the broader racialized structures of violence that currently underwrite such legislation in the United States. I wish to argue that the vigil likewise facilitates an encounter with the crucified Christ. If, as Cone suggests, we find Christ crucified on the lynching tree, and if, as Douglas suggests, we find Christ crucified on the Neighborhood Watch, then we also find Christ crucified at the vigil and among the countless victims of firearm-caused homicide throughout the US today. The vigil brings this association into view in a powerful and sorrowful way. At least it did so for me, and my research thus leads me to ask whether or not it could do so for others. Could it do so for the Christian handgun owners I spent time with? And if so, could this be a way for persons of Christian faith to begin moving beyond the polarization that marks the gun debate? The Vigil discloses that there are a crucified people in our midst, a people whose precarity is increased by the vast presence of guns in our common life. The Christian handgun owner who lives, moves, and has his being in the anticipation of violence remains blind to this reality, which exists in the violence's aftermath. The Christian handgun owner remains unable to see how the vast presence of guns in our common life, the ease with which they can be procured, and the lack of legislation to rein in their presence in traffic generates security for some while increasing precarity and vulnerability for others. And here, thus, is my Christian ethical claim.
Sorry, Michael, but I think we've run out of time.
Okay, perfect.
So I'm going to let you make a last statement so as not to cut you off. Just make a last sentence and bring it to a close.
Sure. Essentially, what I wish to argue is that Christian handgun owners and the church more broadly should engage in practices of solidarity with the victims of gun violence, and that they can begin to do so by keeping vigil. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shade.
I want to thank all of the panelists who have given us such rich thought so far. Dr. Christy Newton, Dr. Richard Lowry, Dr. Michael Grigoni, thank you so much for your presentations. I'm going to be talking to you today about preaching and dialogue, creating a culture of truth, accountability, and empathy. This grows out of my work as the director of this Wabash grant, which was titled Dialogue in the Purple Zone, Pedagogies for Discourse in Online and On-Site Settings. I'm currently conducting a survey of clergy across the United States called Ministry, Preaching, and Social Issues. We've had tremendous response so far. More than 2,600 clergy have responded. And we've learned some interesting things from this survey. First of all, we asked about how people feel regarding preaching social issues. And 32% indicated that they would like to engage social issues in their preaching and teaching, but they feel inhibited. So that's a third of these preachers saying this. And then we also asked, did they feel that their theological training prepared them for this? And a quarter said that they did not feel adequately trained in their theological education for how to address social issues in their preaching and teaching. So this leads me to ask questions about what is the challenge for theological education and congregations today? How can we create a culture of truth, accountability, and empathy in the church when the public square has been ruptured and trust has been eroded? How can we provide tools for facilitating difficult conversations and encouraging civic engagement? That has been my focus during this Wabash grant, figuring out how we can equip clergy for the purple zone in that red-blue divide that we've been hearing about from during this entire teach-in. So that's one of the reasons why we developed this certificate course that we had last year. Dean Martell put together a fantastic program called Church, Community, and Conflict Management, so that we could think about how we could we can weave in a dialogical pedagogy for theological education and ministry. You can see here the list of the classes that we had. Christy Newton taught 2, Richard Coble, Richard Lowry, Elizabeth Conda Frazier, and myself. And we learned some interesting things from the students when we asked them questions about how the experience was for them. So we asked if the course that they took prepared them to have conversations about the social issue that was discussed in the course. And would they feel comfortable doing that in their congregational context? And 100% of them said they either felt very well prepared or somewhat prepared. This is great news, considering what I was just sharing earlier in the 2021 clergy survey, where a quarter of respondents said that their seminaries did not feel prepared. So this is really great news. And I think we can make the case that intentionally having these kinds of dialogues and incorporating this into our pedagogy for our students helps to equip them to go into ministry knowing the kind of divisiveness that we are facing. In the courses that I taught, I introduced students to a method for engaging issues called the sermon dialogue sermon process. And in this process, you begin with a sermon that I call the prophetic invitation to dialogue, which introduces an issue and invites people into a dialogue. The deliberative dialogue is a form of civil discourse that was developed by the Kettering Foundation. And in this process, you bring people together from all kinds of different diversity factors so that people can share each other's stories. And you do this within making sure that you are following respectful rules for engagement. You're deliberating the pros and cons to different approaches to an issue so that you can find common ground and shared values. And then think about what are next steps that we could take as a faith community in response to this issue. So this is helping to develop deep listening, critical thinking skills, and empathy so that when people are engaging on these issues, even if they disagree with somebody on a policy, they're going to see each other's humanity and hear each other's stories. The follow-up sermon is what I call the Communal Prophetic Proclamation. And in this sermon, the pastor incorporates the wisdom that came out of the deliberative dialogue and weaves it into the sermon. The idea is to be able to say, here's what we talked about, and here's how the Spirit guided us through this difficult social issue, and here's where God might be calling us in the future. As part of the Wabash project, we wanted to test this model to see how does it work in congregations. So we brought together 10 pairs of clergy who were alumni of Lexington Theological Seminary, and we asked them to bring with them a lay leader, each bring a lay leader, but they should bring along somebody who was of a different political orientation than they were. And then we brought them all together and we trained them in this sermon dialogue sermon process to carry it out in their congregations. Then when we finished that process over the course of a year, we asked them how it went. And you can see here some of the words that they used to describe how the process proceeded in their congregations. Words like openness, curiosity, feeling a lot of energy and healing. And a lot of them were surprised at how well it went in their congregations. So this was really encouraging. Now, what difference did it make in the congregation itself? Well, we did surveys of congregants before and after the sermon dialogue sermon process. So before the pastors and laity were trained and then after the process went through. And one of the things we did was to test trigger words to find out what words they thought were too political to hear in a sermon. So words like, say, capitalism or climate change. And one of the words that we gave them was the word dialogue. And we found out that dialogue registered cooler in 2020 than it did in 2019. So this might indicate that having a congregation engage in the sermon dialogue sermon method and do deliberative dialogue may have helped them to be more open to civil discourse. So my theory is that if you continue to expose people to this process and other forms of intentional civil discourse, it can help congregations to be more willing to address these social issues in the future. The other thing that we learned is that people were feeling that their church should work to make changes in community and society in both years, but there was an increase between 2019 and 2020. 87% agreed in 2019, 92%. So that's a notable increase. Now, of course, we can't confuse correlation with causation. But I think we can make the case that the sermon dialogue, sermon process in these congregations might have helped to contribute to this increase. So what did we do with our students? Well, we introduced 10 students to the Purple Zone process in an introductory course, and then 12 of them took an advanced course where they also learned the process and carried it out in their congregations. And we asked them, what did you learn from this process? And I'm not going to read the entire list here, but these are some of the things that they said. It helped them to understand how and why people believe what they do. It helped them recognize the need for pastoral care to accompany prophetic preaching. And it helped them to be more convinced the church is not only permitted, but called to address social issues. And I want to share with you just a couple of comments, some quotes that they wrote in their evaluations. One said, "It's reframed my sense of authority to address social issues and build consensus towards sustainable solutions." Another said, "I've decided to be more of a participator in social justice than just a commentator." And a third said, "It has challenged me to move from dialogue to engagement." This is really good news. But the rise of conspiracy theories, lies about the election, and the politicizing of the pandemic has complicated and undermined the dialogue process. And all of this has really come to a head just in the last year. The other thing is that white Christian nationalism, while it's always been a part of American Christianity, has infiltrated congregations in a way that threatens the unity of the church like never before. So, just as a case study, there was an article in the Washington Post just a couple days ago by Peter Manso, and the title was, "His Pastors Tried to Steer Him Away from Social Media, but He Stormed the Capitol Anyway." It's a story about Michael Sparks, who's pictured on the far left. So he was enraged by Black Lives Matter and the protests around the killing of George Floyd. But his pastor, right here in Kentucky, tried to get him off of Facebook. Instead, he actually went to the Capitol and took part in the insurrection. The photo of his booking, in that photo, he's wearing a t-shirt that quotes Ephesians 6:11, "Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." Manso writes, while Sparks' social media posts make clear he connected the election and his religious beliefs, his church community had also been a force cautioning him against letting online resentment take over his life. That tension, religious rhetoric as a go to extremism on the one hand, and community accountability as a safeguard against it on the other, highlight the complex influences some churches have had through the past tumultuous months and yet in the future. I agree. Recommendations based on my research. First of all, I think we just need to equip people for the basics. We got to get back to the basics of the commandment, "You shall not bear false witness." And Jesus' teaching, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Maybe we can help clergy develop curriculum for teens and adults to help them discern truth, facts, and bias in media and news sites. I think we need to have more electives and teach-ins like this and continuing ed to help pastors learn how to preach and teach in the midst of disinformation and cults. We also need to equip for accountability, encouraging pastors to tell the truth about these systems of oppression. We need to help them confront the brutal dishonesty of the communications industry and hold leaders accountable for the consequences of lies. And finally, we need to equip them for courage. There needs to be stronger backing from denominations, and we need to have a prophetic safety net for clergy who lose their positions when they preach the prophetic gospel. So that's a top-down solution, but we also need to have from the bottom up, lay leaders need to be equipped to have the backs of their pastors who speak truth to power. So it's not just the pastor who's the lightning rod for all of this. There's support from above, and support from below. Finally, we might think about this work as vaccinating the body of Christ against lies, toxic rhetoric, gaslighting, and conspiracies. So think about the vaccine as a defanged virus. So the body can build up resistance to when the real thing comes along. So these kinds of conversations about issues of public concern can help inoculate the body of Christ against the more virulent strains of conflict that attack our churches. We can build up a tolerance for difficult conversations in order to discern who God is, what God does, what God expects of us, and how we respond as Christians, individually and as a church. I want to thank all of you for being part of this. I want to thank the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning, who made all of this possible. I want to thank President Charisse Gillette, Vice President and Dean Dr. Lourdes Martel, our students, faculty, and staff at LTS, the team of consultants that worked with me on this grant, the Kettering Foundation for helping to support this research, and my fellow panelists, and all of you. I hope that you'll stick around for our panel discussion and to ask your own questions so that we can engage with you as well.
Thank you, Dr. Shade. I see from our program that we have programmed in another 5-minute break. And I think that that would be a good thing because there's been such rich information that I'm sure that people's heads are like, whoa. I think we need, for the introverts of the world, we need some time to just process that. So according to my watch here, I've got 7:51. Why don't we come back at 7:56 and start our panel presentation? Come back at 7:56. Thank you. We'll begin gathering. What a fantastic discussion we've had so far. And I'm just going to open this up and allow the panelists to speak to each other and to ask questions of each other. So our wonderful technologist, Ms. Dominique Heifel, has just been doing fantastic job there in the background, is spotlighting the panelists. I just want to give her a shout out. And Dr. Lowry will join us in a few minutes, but why don't we begin this conversation?
Well, I have a question for Christy. First of all, thank you for your presentation. First, your visuals were fantastic, and it really helped to, for those of us who are visual learners, that was really helpful to have that. I want to ask you about the ethic of unity. So we're hearing a lot of people say, well, we need to move forward and we can't keep bringing up the past. We have to, if we keep talking about this, then we won't have unity. So there's like this ethic, but it feels like it's being used in a way that's kind of a red herring for accountability, to get us away from accountability. So I'm wondering if like when pastors hear people say that, how could they respond?
That's so interesting, especially for disciples. And I'm currently teaching a course in disciples history and polity, of course, where, unity is our polar star and all of that. Wonderful stuff. And I caution us because, like you say, it absolutely can be. And I think back to the story of Alexander Campbell and his reluctance, his refusal to take a stand on slavery, because it would have sacrificed some of the unity among the churches. So what are we willing to sacrifice for justice is the question. And I also think that his sister, Jane Campbell McKeever, right? She was an active abolitionist who worked with the Underground Railroad. And so I think, doing everything for the sake of unity without thinking of its wider implications has really profound theological, spiritual, and ethical implications. And I would just encourage us to think through it. And in terms of in a congregation, I mean, to point out some of the stories, some of the ways that unity has worked and some of the ways it hasn't worked. I mean, we can look at World War II and some of Bonhoeffer's writing, right? I mean, silence in the face of evil is evil. It may preserve a tentative unity, but what is the greater social cost? And so I think that's where sometimes we need to really slow down and think through what is at stake. And like I said, I could go on about stakeholders and the vulnerable. I loved what Dr. Lowry said about, the integrity and what really resonates with the biblical story. I mean, what is really resonating with the biblical story? Because it's probably not let's get a gun and protect our sanctuary. And I was just so intrigued with all of these presentations as well. But that's in a nutshell, Dr. Shade, what I think. I think we need to slow down and take it apart.
Thank you. Thank you. Others who would like to ask questions of each other. And we've got 10 minutes left, so let's be succinct. Go ahead, Rick, please.
Boy, the presentations were so powerful. Oh my gosh, y'all are just fantastic. I'm so honored to be here. And you stirred up so many things in me and so many emotions. I think that the question I'm struggling with at this point is sort of our, kind of long-standing tradition, particularly in white Christianity, to not bring politics into the church, and certainly not to bring partisan politics in the church. But, I have seen over the last few years, just really bad stuff coming from the top of our political system, coming from the White House, coming from the mouth of our president. And, I just struggle with, what's my responsibility for just calling this stuff out and just naming what needs to be named. I'm just so fortunate to have my friend and co-author William Barber to talk to from time to time, because William kind of keeps me motivated. But I don't know. I just don't quite know what the lines are in terms of just calling what we're dealing with. It's just racist. It's dangerous lies, and I don't know. I struggle with that. So I wonder what anybody else has to say about that. Any of my fellow panelists.
One of the things, speaking of Reverend Dr. Barber, one of the things that he's really skilled with is doing a political critique, but using biblical stories to do it. Oh, yeah. So in the spirit of Emily Dickinson, tell the truth, but tell it slant. He'll go off and he'll tell the story of Pharaoh or, one of the other kings, and he'll put in enough details that you're like, oh, he's talking about, and he'll say, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Pharaoh. And, it's, the equivalence, it's different clothes, but it's the same story.
Yeah.
So I think narrative is one way that just tell the story. And sometimes you can be explicit, sometimes you need to be more implicit, but telling the biblical story and letting that do the preaching for us, with us, I think is one way to get at that.
Yeah, just putting it out there, telling the story and letting the people draw their own conclusions. But, I often try to tell the story in such a way that I'm kind of leading them along in what I'm hoping they'll get from it. But
well, Christy, do you think?
Question. Oh,
no, I was just going to say, do you think ethically are preachers morally obligated to call things out in a really direct way? Just name it for what it is, call a sin a sin.
I think it's absolutely contextual. And I think it's really important to preach social justice. But depending on your context, I think that will determine how you do it. If in some context you need to tell a story and let other people make connections, their own connections with contemporary life, then that works. And in other contexts, it might be, you could be more direct. Like in my context, in California, I'm able to be very clear and direct and straightforward and mince no words. But when I've pastored in Arkansas, it's a little bit different. And it's not a different message, because I agree with what Rick Lowry said about integrity. And I latched on to that, because the message can't change. And that I do believe from an ethical perspective. The way you tell it has to.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a question that particularly triggered.
Oh, sorry. I'm
triggered.
sorry. I was going to jump in. Going to jump in with a question, if that's okay. There's a question I'd like to ask of Michael Grigoni. And it's one of the things in common I keep hearing among all of you is the fact that a lot of this is Christians against Christians. This is something I encountered in Latin America, in the early years of Latin America, the idea that Christians were killing Christians, right? So Michael, I'd like to ask you the question about the role of Christian nationalism in all of this. And what is the role that pastors or churches or seminaries or theological education, and all of us in a day-to-day basis, what role do we play in combating against nationalism?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Dean Martell. I engaged this a bit in my dissertation in dialogue with a book that recently came out by two sociologists named Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. And the book is called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And it's a fantastic sociological study that defines Christian nationalism and as a constellation of views that's not reducible to Christianity itself, of course, but it's a constellation of views that includes nativism and white supremacy, patriarchy. It's ethnic and political as much as it is religious. But the finding the remarkable finding that they advance in the book is that individuals, Christians who are more religiously engaged in their particular ecclesial communities don't subscribe as much to Christian nationalism as those Christians who are disengaged from their ecclesial communities and from religious practice. And I think that resonated quite a bit with Dr. Shade's example in terms of the individual who did storm the Capitol and likely had some kind of distance from his own community, But his pastor was encouraging him not to do that and not to engage with this information online. So I think that gives us some hope and kind of points to the significance of ecclesial practice for shaping the one's political imaginary. So I just offer that as an insight.
Dr. Martell, I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to ask a question of the panelists. Might I? Thank you. Thank you all for just really wonderful, thought-provoking presentations. And take a stab at this. I struggle with the idea that someone really believed that Hillary Clinton was going to a pizza parlor to effectively do damage to another human being, or any number of the things that come out of QAnon. And so my question is, are these kind of these lies, actually, it's not even gaslighting, these lies, are the lies really a pretext for something else, for other beliefs that you then feel as if you can act upon because the behavior that you are attacking is so outrageous? Does that make sense? So QAnon is a pretext so that you can do something else. Can one of you, all of you, speak to that? And I'll mute myself again.
Yeah. One of the things that they've been studying about the techniques of QAnon is that QAnon uses the same kinds of rhetoric and inflammatory imagery that was used against Jews in Nazi Germany. So when they have the Save the Children hashtags on Twitter that come out of QAnon, the idea is that you are manipulating people who really want to do the right thing, like, let's save these poor children from the Democratic pedophiles who are, selling them for, at the basement of a pizza parlor when there's not even a basement in the pizza parlor. So they are very skilled at learning how to manipulate people, and they've learned from history how to do this. There's also a tremendous amount of money to be made from this. They've learned now that QAnon has learned softer ways to market itself. It's now getting into the wholeness and wellness movement. Those who are already sort of suspicious of mainstream medicine. So you're seeing QAnon stuff coming out in like yoga sites and alternative medicine sites, and there's like anti-vax stuff there. So it's finding its we're finding its tentacles everywhere. It's not just the mean old Nazis anymore. They've gotten really smart and how to infect people's minds with this kind of virulent thinking.
If I could jump in, I have a question
Sure.
for all of the panelists.
Okay.
Any of you could respond, but it was triggered by Dr. Shade in your suggestion that we need to equip for accountability and equip for courage. And I think it speaks to all of this in terms of how we move forward. How do we do that? How do we actively equip people going into ministry and lay leaders for accountability and for courage? I think that is so important. What do you think?
Yes, and I think that's a great question, but I'd also like to open it up to participants, if that's okay, because we're running out of time, and they've been patiently waiting for their questions. I know you have patiently waited for your question, but Dr. Newton, there's actually a participant who has asked a very similar question.
Right.
And so I think that you're in tune with that person because they asked the question about that they had listened to the panelists and recalled that building trust is the first step in conversion and change. What thought might the panelists have for building trust with someone who displays QAnon and post-truth? So I think it goes somewhere in the spirit of what you're talking about. I think what we're talking about ultimately is given all these things that we're dealing with, what are the tools? What's our response as educators, but also as pastors? What are the tools? How do we start? At what point? And I'll just open that up to any member of the panel.
Well, one of the things that I've been talking with some people who've dealt with cult behavior, and you can't just convert somebody when their mind is already gone in the direction, like down the rabbit hole. But there are times when the cognitive dissonance creates a little bit of crack in the facade. And that is a time to come in with pastoral care and empathy. So when somebody, like after the insurrection, and then there was the inauguration, there's this sort of like, well, what just happened here? So if you have people who are truly spouting all of this stuff, check in with them emotionally. It usually doesn't work to try to engage them on an intellectual level, like facts. But you can ask them, if this really happened, how would it make you feel? And get them to talk about what emotions are coming up for them, so that they can start to feel you're a trustworthy person who's not going to judge their emotions. And when you can start from a place of relationship and emotional connectivity, that can start to help build bridges for them back away from the QAnon rabbit hole, back to reality, knowing that there's somebody there that they can trust if they start coming through on the other side.
Dr. Newton, does that help begin at least answering some of your question from before?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of possibilities, and I'm just really curious and how we do that, but I do certainly appreciate that answer.
Another question that came very early on was, I think they were addressing Dr. Shade, but I think it's the same thing for the four of you, is who is your audience? As you were doing these presentations, who are you speaking to? I think actually came in when Dr. Newton was presenting, but I think that's a very good question. Who are you speaking to when you have this conversations? So I see Dr. Grigoni, moving his eyebrows. So Dr. Grigoni, who would be your audience when you speak about these things?
Sure. I'm imagining this question in reference to what I hope will eventually, God willing, be a book version of my project. But I see my audience as twofold. I do see my audience with respect to tonight's presentation, as I think is fairly obvious, that I am speaking to those evangelical, politically conservative Protestants who feel compelled to integrate guns into their lives, to just think more deeply about what kind of structure they're participating in, and how their own gun ownership and their practices of concealed carry, etc., sustain this broader structure in which guns are just so easy to get and so ubiquitous in our country. So I'm certainly writing to them, and I uphold the Vigil as a site for them to kind of think about as a way of reevaluating their practice. But I also am trying to address those who would just see these kinds of individuals as repugnant cultural others, to draw a phrase from cultural anthropologist Sandra Harding. I'm hoping, and this kind of ports into Dr. Shea's emphasis on dialogue and empathy and listening to each other's stories. I'm hoping that the book can help disclose, some of the lived experience of these individuals, and provide an opportunity for individuals across the political divide to see each other as more human.
As you were speaking, Dr. Grigoni, I think about, when I was pastoring in New York, and there was a time in which there was a big thing about living in the gap. We as pastors were called to live in the gap and to, between all this brokenness around us. And so that leads me to my next question. And I'm reading from the questions, and I'm just picking and choosing here as I'm looking at the time. And I'd like to start off with with Dr. Lowry. Is it appropriate or reasonable to hold clergy accountable when they fail to raise a prophetic voice, or perhaps worse, when they choose to amplify disinformation?
Yes.
Dr. Newton, are you glad I didn't throw that hot potato at you? I threw it first to Dr. Lowry.
I love it though. Yeah, put him on the hot seat.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I mean, yes. Clergy should be held accountable for not, not speaking the truth. I mean, I think of Ezekiel and the watchtower, and the guy who goes up and, sees the army coming and refuses to yell down and warn the city. You're morally culpable if you don't do that. You may pay a really high price, and in fact, chances are you will, and you may even put yourself in danger, as countless prophetic voices have done through the years. But I just think that's what we're called to do. And I have seen up close the consequences of not calling out this stuff. Sharon and I were living in Oklahoma when the Murrah building was bombed. Sharon was on her way down to Oklahoma City for a meeting at the regional office, and now the ideology of people like Timothy McVeigh is just becoming more and more mainstreamed in our discourse. And I think we have to say the truth on that. I mean, we've just got to confront the evil in that ideology. It's and it's not that the people who are caught up in it are bad people. We need to have empathy. We need to be as respectful as we can. But I think we have a responsibility as pastors to say the truth about that.
Thank you. And so in that same light, Dr. Shade, here's a question I'm going to sort of lob at you now. A participant asks, so what do you do if you have a QAnon in your midst that is tearing your church apart, or it's tearing your family apart? What do you do with that?
Yeah, well, it depends upon what level in which they are participating. So I want to be really clear. If you know that a person has engaged in violence, or that they are threatening to engage in violence, you have to report it. Clergy are mandated reporters. And so if something has happened, or you are worried that something is going to happen, that's like that, on the watchtower, and you see it, we have to let the authorities know, and that cannot be tolerated. Our first mandate is to keep people safe. So that's like the worst case scenario. But if you have people who are spreading these conspiracy theories and are really tearing the church apart, then we need to look to Jesus's instruction on how we deal with people who are disrupting the body of Christ. So it can start with a one-on-one conversation to say, look, I know that you truly believe that this is happening, but here are the consequences of what you're saying. And there are boundaries for what we do. You shall not bear false witness. That's a really basic thing. And if that doesn't work, then you bring in a neutral third party to help with that conversation. And if that still doesn't work, then it's got to go to the governing board to say, that's why I said earlier, it can't just be the pastor. This has to be a united front of the church leadership, whatever denominational person who can have their back, and the pastor saying this, the protection of those most vulnerable has to be a united effort. And if the person truly cannot stay within the bounds of what is acceptable behavior and building up the body of Christ, then you have to take appropriate steps to protect the rest of the body.
Thank you for that. There are such great questions here, and I wish we could spend the next hour asking the great questions here, but we're nearing the end of the time, and I want to be faithful to you and to the audience who have many responsibilities. And so at this time, I'd like to thank all of you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Newton, Dr. Shea, Dr. Grigoni, Dr. Lowry, for these incredible presentations, for this rich conversation. I mean, I be like Mary and just take off my feet, sit at your feet there and just listen to you all evening. And we just might do that after everybody's gone. We might just hang out here and do some more talking. And to thank all of our audience. There were so many of you, and so thank you so very much. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, and you will be sent a link with this wonderful information. And so at this point, I'm going to pass it over to our illustrious president, Dr. Gillette, who's going to give us some final words.
It has been a rich evening, and as I've listened to Dr. Lowry, Dr. Newton, Dr. Grigoni, Dr. Shade, and watch Dr. Martell moderate this conversation, it occurs to me that we're at an inflection point in our society and in our community and our churches. And that inflection point is we must find ways to model conversations that are truthful, that have dignity, but ask hard questions about who we are as church and who we are as Christians. We must find ways to do that. And so I'm grateful for all of you for participating, and really to Dr. Shea for having the vision for this project to keep adding layers to her initial research on preaching in the purple zone. It has become, I think, it will become, as it already is, an important way for our students, and I would say all of us, to embody what it means for us to be present in the world as Christians and as those connected to Lexington Theological Seminary. So I want to close with prayer, and I wrote down a few words, just a few, from our conversation tonight. So with that in mind, let us pray. Dear Creator God, how do we heal the wounds of our community in dialogue and in conversation with one another? How do we have faithful and dignified conversations that embody your witness and your goals in life for us in the world? Help us to listen to one another. Help us to hear one another. Help us to learn from one another so that we may affect the common good for the least of these. Help us to seek and reclaim a dignified truth. This is our prayer. This is our prayer for ourselves, our churches, and our community. Let us be faithful in all that we do. And of course, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. And we pray this prayer in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all.
Amen.
Thank you all.